programa de capacitación. Como parte de una capacitación de una metodología de innovación para el trabajo sistémico basado en misiones para contribuir a la recuperación económica de los países, a fin de desarrollar acciones estratégicas a gran escala en sectores claves para el país, en el que la ciencia, la tecnología y la innovación generan valor sistémico para el mercado. Es así que con el objetivo de tener un mejor entendimiento de las buenas prácticas globales para la promoción de trabajo sistémico de actores del ecosistema de innovación en torno a un fin conjunto dentro del sector o reto transversal priorizado, el Instituto de Innovación y Propósito Público de la University College London brindará un curso en línea para actores del ecosistema en el enfoque Mission Oriented Research and Innovation, la misma que viene siendo coordinada entre British Council y Concitec. Para tal efecto daremos las palabras al señor Henry Harman, director de Políticas y Programas de Concitec. Adelante, Henry.
Buenos días con todos. Mi nombre es Henry Harman, director de Políticas y Programas de Concitec. Deseo saludar en primer lugar a la embajadora Kate Harrison, del Reino Unido del Perú, a la señora Samantha Lanaway, directora del British Council en el Perú, así como a su equipo de colaboradoras, en especial Claudia Celis y Victoria Copete. En nombre del Concitec, me es muy grato darles la bienvenida en este importante seminario con el University College of London y un equipo destacado de especialistas e investigadores del Reino Unido, que es una nueva muestra del valioso apoyo no amazing, pero importante apoyo del Reino Unido con el Perú. Para los participantes, que es un destacado grupo de funcionarios públicos del gobierno peruano, creo que esta será una valiosa oportunidad para intercambiar experiencias sobre un tema de importante actualidad, cual es Talent Oriented Innovation. Sobre innovación. En especial, la conferencia magistral que comenzará en breve minuto de la conocida economista Mariana Mazzucato será una oportunidad única, ya que es la primera vez que Concitec logra conseguir su participación en un evento. Sin más, entonces, nuevamente, a nombre de Concitec, mis más expresivas gracias a todos por participar y mucha suerte en las sesiones. Gracias.
Gracias, Henry. A continuación, a Kate Harrison de la Embajada Británica en Perú. Kate, adelante, por favor.
Muchas gracias. And thank you very much, Henry, colleagues from Concitec, UCL, the Embassy and the British Council. It's a pleasure to be joining you all this morning. So welcome to this initiative of the Newton Fund, which is the UK's fund to promote the development of communities of researchers and innovators working together in different countries for sustainable economic development and social well-being. UK and Peru collaboration on science innovation is a key pillar of our economic development partnership, with a particular focus on health, biodiversity, and climate change. And we believe that by creating relationships between researchers and innovators, we enable the sharing of ideas that will strengthen both of our science and innovation systems and help us collaborate and innovate to find solutions to global challenges. For the UK, innovation and evidence-based policymaking, risk management, and sharing skills and expertise are all vital to ensure and enable that sustainable development. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made it even more evident the huge challenges that governments, institutions, and the private sector face to meet the needs of their citizens. It's forced societies to find new ways to stay connected and to advance economically without putting the population at risk and while ensuring their wider well-being. In Peru and in the UK, key sectors like tourism have faced major challenges and had to transform to keep working, to protect employment, and to enable future growth when the time comes. But the shock that COVID-19 has delivered to our previous way of life has shown us something of the level of disruption that society could face from the even greater challenge of climate change if we fail to find clean, resilient, and inclusive ways to recover. We have an opportunity to build back better from this crisis. Research and innovation will be essential to finding the solutions we need, and advances in research and innovation will lead to the economic growth and help deliver what we need for the future. In recent decades, significant progress has been made in improving people's health, enabling a fuller contribution from women and the rich diversity of all of our populations. Laws have been designed and implemented to foster open and just societies. Action has been taken to protect our planet, but much, much more is needed. Research and innovation can provide the tools to enable the solutions to the challenges we now face as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, from vaccines to treatments, to education, to enabling safe and different economic activity. Because ultimately, research and innovation is the key to unlocking the potential of millions and millions more people around the world. The UK has a world-leading research and innovation base and is proud to play a leading role in addressing global challenges, such as combating antimicrobial resistance, ensuring food and nutrition security, building resilience to natural disasters. I'm confident that today's lecture will be a new starting point to inspire even more sharing, even more collaboration of ideas on innovation between our two countries. And this will be followed by a series of tailored sessions for Peruvian science innovation policymakers and stakeholders in academia and the private sector, with a particular focus on the tourism sector. But before handing over, I would like to share just two things that illustrate how pleased we are in the Embassy to welcome today's keynote speaker. When the head of the British Diplomatic Service at the time, Sir Simon MacDonald, visited Lima in January this year, my team asked him to bring a copy of one of Mariana Mazzucato's books as a gift for the then Minister of Economy, Tony Alva. And also this year, with the Science and Innovation Commission, headed at the time by now President Sagasti, we had a long discussion about how mission-centered innovation could play a part in supporting and promoting growth in Peru. Now with President Sagasti in his new role, I believe this is very good news for Peru's research and innovation community, and also for the international actors who want to work with them over the next few months. I'm delighted, therefore, I'm truly delighted to welcome economist Mariana Mazzucato, whose Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is based at University College London. She will share her views on innovation and specifically the idea of mission-oriented innovation. Professor Mazzucato and her team are changing how innovation and public value is imagined, practiced, and evaluated. I want to end by thanking Concitec and the British Council for their commitment and work to bring this all together today. Thank you very much, everybody, for a collaboration that I see will go on for the future. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Gracias, Kate. A continuación, pasamos a la señora Samantha Lanaway, directora Perú de British Council. Samantha, adelante, por favor.
Muy buenos días con todos y todas. De parte de British Council estamos muy contentos de tener todos reunidos juntos hoy día. Esta capacitación es parte del trabajo del British Council junto a nuestros aliados estratégicos para reducir las brechas en el ecosistema de ciencia, tecnología e innovación mediante la participación de actores en los sectores académico, gubernamental y empresarial en todo el país, con la finalidad de fortalecer fortalecer la capacidad de las personas e instituciones para maximizar el impacto de sus esfuerzos. La emergencia nacional en el Perú por la COVID-19 ha resaltado la necesidad de alinear las estructuras organizativas para maximizar su capacidad de respuesta a las necesidades ciudadanas, tanto a nivel público como privado. Con el objetivo de tener un mejor entendimiento de las buenas prácticas globales para promover el trabajo sistémico en torno a un objetivo conjunto o un reto de prioridad transversal, se eligió a University College London para que, como parte de su asistencia técnica, brinde un curso en línea para todos los actores del ecosistema en el enfoque Mission Oriented Research and Innovation. En los meses de noviembre y diciembre se darán 5 conferencias que cubrirán los temas de innovación con enfoque en misiones, política para activación de la innovación, pensamiento sistémico, transformación digital y habilidades dinámicas. Estas se ofrecerán como conferencias en vivo, como hoy, lo que permitirá la interacción y sesiones de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, de parte de British Council, deseo que disfruten y aprovechen al máximo el evento de hoy, así como los que están por venir este mes que viene. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias, Samantha. A continuación, Mariana Mazzucato de la University College London, quien presentará al equipo de UCL.
Hello, everyone. Before we formally introduce Mariana, I would like to introduce to you the UCL team. And we have Antonio Andreoni, who wasn't able to join today, but we've got a little video that I'm going to share with you.
Hola Peru, this is Antonio from the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London. I'm particularly thrilled to start this journey, this training program with you across all different government institutions to focus on a set of very important policy instruments. Industrial innovation, mission-oriented policies are very up in the agenda across the world because they've been recognized as critical ways to develop an inclusive and sustainable society. I've been working across the world with different government institutions, and I hope to bring some of that knowledge, expertise, experiences from other countries, often in similar sectors that are at the core of the Peruvian economy, to develop together new ideas, new framework, new way of thinking around the role of the state and the role of these specific set of industrial and innovation policy. We will also engage with the new challenges and opportunities that digitalization and industrial digitalization will present to the country. I would strongly encourage you to register in the Newton Palette training to learn how to rethink together the Peruvian innovation and inclusive growth.
All right, next we have Rainer Kato, who is here today. Rainer, do you want to
Yeah, I'm actually here, yeah. Hi. Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Rainer Kato. I'm Professor of Innovation and Public Governance at the IIPP. And I think I will be the last in the program. So I will be at the end of the program talking about more public administration issues around capabilities, especially dynamic capabilities. And I'm sure it'll be, by that time, you will have all the new concepts from Mariana, Antonio, and Kate, and we'll try to see how do we implement them as well then. So hopefully it'll be full circle, and really looking forward to discussing these issues with you over the next, before Christmas actually, and so that's great.
Thank you, Rainer. And we have Kate Roll, who has also been leading on the organization of the course as well. Kate.
Hi there. I'm Kate Roll. I'm an assistant professor at IIPP in Innovation, Development, and Purpose. And it's been just a real pleasure to work with CONCITEC, with the British Council and the support of the British Embassy to start this program. And I'll be doing a little bit of teaching on systems thinking and systems change. And then I'll be working with some of you in the beginning of the new year. But we're really looking forward to this program. And thank you so much for joining today.
All right, back to you, Diana.
Gracias, Diana. Bueno, a continuación damos inicio a la conferencia magistral de Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana es profesora de Economía de la Innovación y el Valor Público y directora fundadora del Instituto de Innovación y Propósitos Públicos de UCL. Adelante, Mariana.
Gracias, es un verdadero honor de estar con ustedes. Yo soy italiana, entonces cuando hablo español parezco una argentina, porque los argentinos piensan de ser italianos, pero no lo son. Y bueno, voy a continuar en inglés, si no, no me van a entender. So it's a real honor to be able to, do the first lecture for you all. It's very much going to be about how to have better policies, requires actually beginning with first principles of asking, what is the role of policy? What is the role of the state in the economy? What does it mean to actually design public-private partnerships with a really ambitious notion of what the public part is about? We have business schools worldwide trying to help corporate managers rethink their organizations, make sure their organizations don't become inertial, slow, too bureaucratic. But when we see bureaucracy in the government, we just say it's too bureaucratic. We don't think, how do we redesign a bureaucracy to be creative, to be dynamic, to be entrepreneurial, to be innovative, and to absolutely create value, co-create value, co-create markets, not just fix problems when they arise. So this will be the key concept of my talk. Let me share my screen now. This is usually the hardest bit. Okay. Bon, is the screen, let me just make sure it's on. There we go. So what I'd like to do is to share with you this notion of putting purpose, public purpose, at the center of policymaking, and to do so with a concrete idea of missions. Yeah, la misión al centro de la política económica, de la economía política, and what does it mean for the policy design, and really, again, for the design of the partnership between the public and the private sector. And the Institute, which I founded and direct, I founded it almost 3 years ago, was very much set up with this idea because I had written books and papers about the state needing to think differently, to co-create value, not just to fix market failures. But on the one hand, I met a lot of thirst, a lot of willingness in governments to change how they were operating. And on the other hand, the tools on the ground, the way we think about the debt, the deficit, procurement, just it wasn't changing fast enough. So this idea of both designing policies to be more ambitious, but to get our hands dirty with what does it really then mean for the tools on the ground, for the accounting, for the culture in an organization, for the design of the procurement, the grants, the industrial strategy. This is, I think, the challenge. So what we would like to do is to share with you also our experience in working globally around this notion of transforming the status quo thinking around innovation policy, industrial strategy, to really be challenge oriented, to be able to be as ambitious as the goals that are inside our 17 sustainable development goals, to backtrack and ask, what does it mean for how we do things every day differently? The talk today, the lesson, will be structured in 4 different areas. The first, I want to convince you why we need to talk more about the direction of growth less about the rate. The second will be how to do this, how to talk about the direction of growth through missions and to use a mission-oriented design to our policies. The third will backtrack and also think about value. What does it mean when we have mission-oriented policies around challenges to then construct the relationship between the different actors in the economy so they are sharing both the risks and the rewards. So sharing the creation, but also the distribution. And I think this is very important in Latin America, by the way, where often the progressive parties or the progressive economists have focused in some ways too much about the redistribution and not enough about the pre-distribution, how to get the conditions right in the first place to produce less inequality, not just afterwards to have to redistribute the wealth in a more progressive way, even though redistribution is very important as well. And fourth, I'd like to finish with some examples that I've been working on recently with the Inter-American Development Bank around examples in Colombia, in Chile, and Mexico around mission-oriented policies, and to especially then finish with the question of what might this look like in Peru. So first, on the direction of growth. So this is, I think, a moment, this moment that I'm speaking to you, the moment that we are all living, a very exciting one for you to be taking this course, because there's so much talk about direction. There's lots of talk about it, but not enough grounding in how to do things differently. But let's just pause a moment and admit that it's a very good moment for the talk, because there's a lot of it. So 5 years ago, the Sustainable Development Goals were set. They have been agreed on globally by almost every country, Peru, of course, included. There's 17 goals with 169 targets beneath them. And you know, people talk about them all the time, the SDGs. And the question is, what do they mean for how we structure our economy, for how we think about interdepartmental and intersectoral working together, for the investment pathway, for the industrial strategy? We also have a big global discussion about the Green New Deal and the green transition. In the United States, this has been led by very young Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she managed to convince the Democratic Party to talk this language. In Europe, the Green Deal is now at the center of the European transformation, to the point that now with the COVID recovery, the conditions that are being set on the individual countries is no longer austerity, which was the condition after the financial crisis to receive funds from Europe, but the conditions are on investments towards the climate mitigation strategies and digitalization. But there's lots of talk about all the different countries requiring a Green Deal. Sweden has made it a national mission to have a green welfare state, so a fossil-free welfare state. And at the city level, lots of different discussions like in Copenhagen. And industrial strategy has come back in many countries. After decades of being a blasphemy, you couldn't use the word industrial strategy without people thinking you were a communist. So anyway, all these discussions, and I know this is also true of Latin America. I was recently in different panels with Alicia Bárcena from CEPAL, where lots of discussions in Latin America about the green transition, about the SDGs, about growing in a more sustainable, inclusive way. So this is positive, it's wonderful. Yes, great conversation. However, this is now the bad side. We don't know how to do it. We continue to pretend that policy, the policymaker, is simply there to fix a market failure. You actually have to wait for the market to fail. So not enough investments in areas like research, or too much investment in pollution for the state to come in and to fix the problem. So the idea is that you fix the negative externality problem with a carbon tax, the public good or positive externality problem with some funding of something, or information asymmetries. You come in and you help the small companies, and all these different failures that need to be fixed is how we design policy. So we're always too little, too late, because you have to actually wait for something to fail before you enter. And a lot of what we do in IIPP, our institute that is speaking to you today and over the next classes, is saying this is where we need to rethink completely. We need a different framework for policy for the state if we're going to be ambitious around the directions. And that needs to be around co-creating and co-shaping markets, not just fixing them. And the reason is because if you don't have that framework of co-shaping and co-creating instead of fixing, you end up with these very stupid assumptions and stupid policies, which continue to pretend that value is created in business, and the policymaker, the Kafka-esque bureaucrat here on the right, is there just to get the rules right, you know, fund the basics like infrastructure, schools, research, and then get the hell out of the way for the market to decide the direction, yeah? And yet this directional push that I talked about, the Green Deal, the SDGs, are never gonna happen if we don't have both sides, public and private, thinking out of the box, designing their organizations in a creative way, investing, co-investing, taking risks, having a portfolio approach towards those transitions. But the narrative continues to be, like in The Economist, almost every week, they say this, that you see here, which is that government doesn't know how to invest. It should simply level the playing field, fix the market failures, enable and de-risk the private sector, and leave the rest to the revolutionaries in business. And so a lot of my work has been about debunking, how do you say, destroying the myths, los mitos, behind this. And so I wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, which looked back in history and said, look, all the big changes we've had, which have driven growth in capitalism globally, have not happened from a market fixing perspective. It actually required market creating and market shaping by all the different actors in the system. And in fact, all the general purpose technologies that you see here, from the internet to green technology, would never have happened without the state actually investing, being an investor of first resort in some of the higher risk areas, especially with capital intensity. And in a minute, I'll talk to you why this is not just about developing countries like the United States and the Soviet Union, but the story is even more true in developing countries. But first, what I did in the book was to argue, you know, everything that makes our smartphones smart and not stupid was funded by the taxpayer. Internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, and it was funded by public money, like the internet from DARPA, GPS from the Navy, and so on. But even more interesting is that the funding, the public money, was housed inside public organizations like DARPA that were not thinking about the technology. DARPA did not care about the internet. It had a problem to solve. It needed the satellites to communicate, and the internet was a solution. Or GPS, the Navy required it to have much more precise positioning of where the ships were in the sea. So really, one of the important things to ask is, what do we know about mission-oriented organizations, problem-solving organizations? How are they structured? What is their remit? How do they do the budgeting? How do they welcome risk-taking? How do they organize their portfolios in order to be problem-oriented? And how do they, you know, welcome the risk-taking that's required? Because anytime you're going to try to solve a problem, like learning how to ride a bicycle, you will have to fall off the bicycle many times. So trial and error and error and error. And even though the venture capitalists, so the entrepreneurial community brags, they boast that they like risks, when a civil servant, when a public servant takes risks and sometimes makes mistakes, as is normal for any risk taker, they get fired. They get put on the front page of the newspaper. They get told to stop picking winners and to go back to simply fixing the market. So this is a huge problem, which historically means that when we had directions, when we had problems to solve, the state actually had to take risks, and yet the narrative of what the state is for doesn't let it take risks. So I was very interested, and this is why I set up IIPP. I wanted to make this a systemic, change in how governments were thinking. And the curriculum that we're setting up through our master's program is very much organized around this. What does it mean to have entrepreneurial bureaucracies, risk-taking bureaucracies, which are organized around big problems, yeah? The problems that are very ambitious, like the ones in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are social problems, much harder than some of the technological problems, that got us to the moon and back. The internet being one of the spillovers from that. And a colleague of mine, Richard Nelson, wrote a wonderful book in 1977 called The Moon and the Ghetto. He was basically saying, how can it be that, in the modern industrial era, we got to the moon, we put a man on the moon, and we don't know how to get rid of ghettos. We don't know how to get rid of favelas. We still have huge inequality. We have weak healthcare systems, and we got a man on the moon. It's hard to get to the moon, believe me, yeah? So this idea that actually the social problems are even harder than getting to the moon. They require political change, regulatory change, behavioral change, organizational innovation, social innovation, and of course, technological innovation. But they also require admitting that it's urgent. When we go to war, nobody says we don't have the money. No one ever says we don't have money, we will not go to Afghanistan, to Iran, to Iraq, or World War II to fight the war. Why? Because they say it's urgent, it's for security, we go fight the war. They find the money, yeah? So what would it look like to treat the Sustainable Development Goals with the same level of urgency that we apply when we go to war or when we go to the moon, but to transform these as concrete missions? These are very general, these challenges. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are general challenges. I think in Spanish you say desafíos or desafíos. Sorry, pronouncing it wrong. Sfide, we say in Italian. So we need to transform them into concrete missions. But we also have to change the vocabulary. In IIPP, we always begin with crossing words out. We say, stop saying you're fixing markets. You're creating them. Stop saying you're de-risking the private sector. You're welcoming uncertainty. Stop saying you're leveling the playing field. You have to tilt the playing field towards the direction of change and have a portfolio approach within that to fund as many different possibilities as possible, but also to reward certain types of behavior with your tax system or other types of issues we can talk about later. You're not picking winners, but picking the willing, trying to get as many different actors in the system to move along with you towards a transformation, and so on. So this brings me to the second part of the agenda. If anyone wants to ask a question, I was going to leave 20 minutes at the end. But if you have a burning question, I don't know, someone can maybe be looking at the hands being raised, but I think it might be best for me to go on until the end, and then we open it up for discussion, if that's okay. So the second part of the agenda is to explain what the hell I'm talking about. What do I mean when I'm talking about missions? Why is it different from how we do things? So I just mentioned the moon landing, no? The moon and the ghetto. How could we go to the moon and we can't solve the ghetto? First of all, what did it mean to go to the moon? It required real leadership. Yeah, you should read the speech by Kennedy back in the early 60s, where he said, it's going to cost a lot of money. We're going to waste a lot of money. We're going to fail, but it's worth it. And he talked about why it was worth it. He first talked about, the need to beat the Russians, but he also talked about all the massive technological spillovers that he believed would come about. And they did. The entire software industry, software as a sector, came about as a spillover from trying to get to the moon. No one thought about software. They just needed it in order to get to the moon and back. It required many different sectors to innovate in the private sector. So NASA led it, the Apollo program, but there was a lot of innovation in the private sector in the area of nutrition, materials, electronics, aeronautics. Many different companies, large and small. The big companies were General Electric, Motorola, which actually at the time was still small, Honeywell, and some other more medium-sized companies. And it required a huge amount of experimentation. Most of the projects failed. We know of the ones that succeeded, but a lot of things failed. And of course, you know that some of the Apollo astronauts actually died along the way. So the failure was also life-threatening. And so what we did in the Institute was to work backwards and say, okay, that was hard, but how interesting of what it means to have a really bold goal, to begin with a challenge, which at the time was the space race, make it a concrete mission, which has to be targeted. You have to be able to answer yes or no. Did you achieve it? Did you get to the moon and back in a generation? You can answer that. You can't answer the space race, yeah? So begin with the big challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals, turn them into concrete missions, like getting the plastic out of the ocean, right? That's very concrete if you set yourself an objective of how much plastic over what amount of years, and get as many different sectors to work with you along the way. So move away from a sector approach, especially economies with lots of natural resource sectors. Think about how all your different sectors, some of them will be natural resources, some of them will be more on, say, the high-tech digital end, some will be old sectors like steel, construction, materials, how they can work together towards solving a goal together. But especially on these blue circles on the bottom, what that means for a redesign of policy, procurement, grants, loans, prize schemes, to crowd in as much experimentation as possible. Because if you have a linear concept of policy, you know, here's the goal and we're just going to win for sure this amount of money, this amount of output, it's not going to happen. The non-linearity, the feedback, the learning, the interdepartmental kind of feedback effects need to be designed within the system in order to foster that kind of creativity and spillover effects that the moon landing had. So again, this is just an example. If you take the Sustainable Development Goals 13 and 14, if you take the SDG 14 around climate change, this was the example that I wrote about in this report here on the left, which became in Europe law because the parliament voted on the report. It was very nice that I finally wrote something that someone had to vote on in the parliament. So now it's a emissions instrument. And the idea is exactly this. Now you begin with something like climate change, which is very bold and, you know, a challenge, transform it into a goal of like 100 carbon neutral cities by 2030 with a clear target within that, and get all the different sectors from the energy sector, real estate, construction, which is an old sector. It's not, you know, a modern high-tech sector, but it can transform itself to help solve goals, food, the social sector and social services, and so on, to work together towards solving that problem. So instead of having an approach where you choose 4 top sectors, what you're really choosing is the problem to get all your different sectors to work towards. And all those different projects on the bottom, like a citizen carbon ID card, or carbon neutral urban food industry, or clean urban electric mobility, buildings with carbon absorbing components. These are just examples of some of the solutions bottom up that would come to the system, but they don't happen out of, you know, miracles. They happen through the policy design. And so in Italy, where I'm from, our way of doing procurement, we call it appalto, is very boring. It's very static. It doesn't nurture any bottom-up experimentation at all. It's often the usual suspects that are getting the contracts with the public sector. And it's definitely not a tool for innovation. If anything, it stifles innovation. And so really rethinking the design of those tools like procurement with already the goal of using them to crowd in that bottom-up experimentation for a public goal is a huge revolution. You know, it's easier to come up with a mission. It's much harder to design the tools to crowd in the experimentation to get there. And so what is a mission? You know, I've already said they have to be bold, inspirational, with wide societal relevance, have a clear direction, targeted, measurable, and time-bound. So you can say yes or no, did you achieve it? They have to be ambitious, but also realistic. And here I was focusing mainly on the research and innovation system of Europe. But really, if you think of it in terms of productive capacity, You want to be pushing the productive capacity to reach new frontiers, but you need to be, of course, working with the existing capacity you have, but bringing together these different areas that maybe just have not worked together because they have been working in silos. Be cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, cross-actor, and to drive through bottom-up solutions. How did I get muted? Sorry. The second report, called Governing Missions, was how do we implement this? What does it mean for who decides the mission? Is it top down, Kennedy telling everyone what to do? No. Modern day missions based on the Sustainable Development Goals need to be co-created. You don't just tell citizens they need a carbon neutral city, you find ways to bring them together at the local level, especially to design carbon neutral ways of living, to bring different voices to the table. We need different targets and milestones, which along the way tell us if we're getting closer or not to achieve the missions. If not, we should turn the tap off. DARPA, which I mentioned before, which invented the internet, was just as good as turning the tap off as it was turning it on. You need proactive portfolio management, so you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, but actually spreading the risk across a space. You need flexible and adaptable organizations that are willing to change what they're doing based on the feedback. You need accountability. And again, having citizens engaged in the accountability is interesting. You need ways to finance and crowd in other forms of finance. So precisely by having missions that are bold and inspirational, you can increase the expectations in the business community of where future growth opportunities lie. This is why Denmark today is the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China, because they have been able to crowd in lots of different types of finance to their national missions, creating a whole startup community around services, green services, not just green manufacturing. And they were being able to get crowded in also from the venture capital community, but it wouldn't have existed without really strong city level, regional and national missions, which created excitement around the green transition. And we fundamentally need new public sector capabilities. And I've already talked about this, so I'll move on. And what's important in thinking about missions, for those of you who have thought about industrial strategy in the past, is that it's not that we don't need horizontal policies. Horizontal policies are policies around skills, education, research, and infrastructure, the kind of background basics. You always need that, otherwise the economy is not strong. Really what missions are doing is changing how we think about vertical policies. Vertical policies are policies that in the past, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, focused on particular sectors. And in Latin America, this was very much also around import substitution models of development. And the idea is, instead of focusing on particular sectors that you think you're going to become great at, because sometimes by the time you do that, the sector has changed and you're again too late. The idea is to really use the problem setting role to define that kind of directional shift. So you're choosing problems, not sectors, and increasing the capacity of all your sectors to work together towards solving those problems. These are problems around, again, issues around inequality, the digital divide, climate transition. And it's hard to think of any sector that's not going to be important in, say, a climate-related strategy. But similarly around health, if you think of all the preventative areas that need investing in, that would of course include all sorts of different sectors around food, lifestyle, and so on. I've already talked about missions. Let me just move on because I want to get here. So what we ended up doing in the Institute, I want to make sure we give enough time for discussion. And in the discussion, please ask me in Spanish and I'll respond in English, but feel free to ask me any questions in Spanish. We asked ourselves, what does it mean to bring this concept of missions to the design of the institutions, right? So a public bank, okay? Like in Brazil, I worked with a public bank called BNDES. The BNDES actually had different phases in its history. including where the funding came from. But one of the phases I looked at was very similar to the Italian phase of public banking, which is just money being given out to the companies that need help because they're failing. Yeah, so it becomes a subsidy, a handout, a guarantee to pretty bad companies that are struggling because they're not very innovative. How do you transform a public bank to be mission-oriented, so it's providing patient, long-term finance to those companies that are willing to change, to transform, to collaborate around these public missions? So you have conditionality embedded in the structure of the loans. This is something that the German public bank, the KfW, did in recent years, where they provided loans to the steel industry, conditional on the steel industry lowering its material content in order to adapt to the mission being set by the government around Energiewende for a green transition. And the steel industry in Germany has become one of the most innovative in the world, because in order to reduce the material content and the carbon emissions that they had to do to receive a public loan, they had to innovate. They innovated through new technology and techniques and services to introduce repurpose, reuse, and recycle across the whole value chain. And they did it because they had to in order to get the loan, not because they were just, very good participants in society. So we helped set up a whole new bank in Scotland where we, because Scotland, like the rest of the UK, doesn't have patient finance. There's lots of short-term finance. So patient long-term finance from the public bank that was mission-oriented. And the Scottish economy is interesting because at the macro level, they have this Scotland National Performance Framework, similar to New Zealand, which has used the SDGs to set targets for the country. And so, the fact that the public bank is designing the loans in order to foster transition towards these SDG areas is very interesting. Similarly, we just wrote a report this month, myself and Olga Mikiva, with the European Investment Bank, because in Europe, the bank is now calling itself the Climate Bank, focused on the circular economy. So we looked at what that actually meant for the structure of its loans. So again, we can't have missions without then asking, what does it mean for changing how we give out loans, grants, and design procurement? And in Italy, this is Giuseppe Conte. He's actually more good looking in person than I thought. I'm his special advisor, and I've been helping the country think through how to receive and adapt to the European recovery plans around the green transition in this moment of COVID-19, where the recovery funds are conditional on having a strategy. And so I wrote a report with them, and it was very interesting because the tendency in Italy has been to do the opposite of what I'm talking about. Instead of starting with the strategy and then crowding in the projects, they have a lot of projects, raining in on the government, which then after the fact has to create a strategy on top of them. And that becomes very hard. If you have a fully bottom-up process, it becomes very hard for the sum to amount to anything greater than all the individual parts. So this has been a big challenge in Italy, especially given the static public-private relationship where there's lots of expectations in the private sector to simply get help from the government as opposed to transform. And this really brings me to this question of public value, because when you admit that value is co-created between different actors, instead of just thinking it's created in business and then redistributed from government or fixing markets, it really does require asking different questions, asking questions around directionality, which I talked about, organizational capacity, so flexibility, adaptability, new ways of doing accounting, new ways of doing assessment, how we evaluate our policies outside of a static cost-benefit analysis, but also, and I wanted to focus a bit on this now, sharing of risks and rewards. So, how do you actually develop mechanisms so the public and private sectors are really co-creating the value together, sharing the risks, but also the rewards. And I do think this is a very important pillar for Latin America for the reasons I said before, which is that at least countries with progressive governments have not thought enough about how we create wealth differently. There's been too much focus on redistribution, which is very important. I believe strongly in redistribution, progressive policies, but there's nothing to redistribute if we don't create wealth in a different way. And so I just wanted to focus a bit on that also because I write a lot about it in my book on value. And this is really about thinking, once you have public investment through a public bank, innovation agency, or different types of programs like guaranteed loans, what is the new relationship with the private sector? For example, conditionalities on making sure that the profits earned by the private sector are actually reinvested back into production and not siphoned out, extracted. That's why the subtitle of my book was Making and Taking in the Global Economy. Or what does it mean for how we govern intellectual property rights, patents, so that they are not abused simply to extract rents, but really foster more innovation and diffusion? What does it mean for the ability of government to, in some cases, retain equity in the investments they make? So in the US case, Obama gave as much money to Tesla as he did to Solyndra. But Solyndra went bust, bankrupt. The taxpayer bailed them out, $500 million. Tesla, successful, the money just went to Elon Musk. And so what was interesting was that Obama said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company, which was a stupid thing to say. Stupid assumptions lead to stupid policies. He should have said, if you pay the loan back, which they did, we get 3 million shares in your company. And the price per share between 2009, 2013 went from 9 to 90. And that difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss in the next round. So that way of thinking, portfolio-minded, investor of first resort, co-creating alongside the private sector, but also sharing the rewards, not just the risks, is the change in mindset. So it's not about public ownership and nationalize everything. It's actually about sharing together, both public and private, the rewards that are fostered from this public risk-taking. And this is especially when it's downstream investments. If it's upstream investments like in research and development, the return is as much spillover and spillover of the knowledge as possible. But when companies are receiving the money from the public sector, there's no reason why you can't set it up like a venture capitalist would, with a portfolio and making sure you get some of the upside to fund the downside and so on. And this moment of COVID-19, I think, is a very interesting moment to think about this, because in many parts of the world, there's huge amounts of money being put into the system, especially to save those sectors which will, go bankrupt without state support. But how do you introduce conditionality into that relationship so the state is not just bailing out those that need immediate help, but really creating some sort of new relationship? And I think this is the moment, because for 2 years now, the large global corporates who have operations everywhere, in Peru as well, don't think of them as American corporates, these are global corporates with value chains everywhere, are talking about changing their business model to be more purpose-driven. And this idea of stakeholder value, so for the value to be returned to all the stakeholders, not just the shareholders, is a very interesting pillar through which missions can set up a new public-private partnership. And it's a good test to, test the walk of the talk around stakeholder value. And, if you even think of the vaccine now for COVID-19 with all the global experiments that are happening, how we govern the vaccine to be purpose-driven matters. This is why the World Health Organization is talking about a people's vaccine that makes sure that we actually pool the patents, creating a patent pool to share as much knowledge between countries collaboratively, so that we foster collective intelligence instead of just private profits, especially given how much public money is going into the vaccine itself. This would be a very different way to bring purpose into health innovation in a way that hasn't been there in the past. Even the COVID drug, remdesivir, is the name of the medicine, being produced by Gilead, is being sold for $3,200 per dosage, even though it was mainly publicly financed. So We've always gotten this wrong in the past. And now that we have such urgency with the vaccine, we should use this as a new way to collaborate, to structure public-private partnerships, which are goal-oriented, but get the details right of how to really partner in a symbiotic way. And the fact that some countries, like in France and Austria, they have created strong conditions attached to the money that companies are getting, like Air France and Renault, conditional on carbon reduction, is an interesting experiment. In Austria, they also said that companies that use tax havens and that avoid tax are not able to access the COVID recovery schemes. In the US, Elizabeth Warren pushed for companies that receive COVID recovery cannot use it just to, distribute dividends or do share buybacks. And, in the UK, we didn't do this. We just bailed out EasyJet, 600 million, no conditions attached. So there's real heterogeneity in how countries are using this public money to leverage a different public-private symbiotic ecosystem. And I think it's very interesting to use this as a moment to do public-private differently. We are working in Spain, in a region of Spain called Biscay, because they have a very interesting cooperative model inside their corporate governance. And we've been talking to them about what does a cooperative model look like for a transition in society, to bring trade unions, citizens, corporates, and the government together in new ways. And Kate Roll, who's here on the call, and some of our colleagues are also helping the their tax policy, the policies around their impuestos, for how do you actually reward certain types of behaviors in the corporate community through the tax incentives that the government can give out, SDG. So let me just say that the last point of this lecture, because I want to open it up to questions, is that we've just started now working in Latin America around some of these concepts. It began with the report that I've been working on for the last 5 years, actually, with the Inter-American Development Bank, to really ask, what does this look like in countries which in the past have been more wed to these industrial strategies around natural resources? What does it mean to transform the question of the resource curse actually to one where the resources become a very important input towards a structural transformation of the economy? And we looked at different examples, again, around Chile, Colombia. In Colombia, for example, they had a very interesting city-level mission called Medellín, la más educada, which really actually included lots of different sectors. This one actually here, sorry, this one here is showing the one around sustainable and inclusive development and all the different sectors like human capital, infrastructure, universities, environment, and innovation, which would have to come together to collaborate in new ways. And again, to have very specific goals like the one here in Chile around the mining sector, to have a virtuous, inclusive, and sustainable mining to improve the quality of life of current and future generations. And again, what does this look like if you take it outside of just the mining sector, but have mining as part of the mission itself, but then bring all those different sectors along the way and use the policy levers to crowd in, as we saw before with the other blue circles, these different types of projects on the ground. Oops. Just go here, sorry. So really what we want to do, because I don't want to focus on other countries right now, because for any country, you can really think of any mission, but the point is that it needs to be local. It needs to be contested and brought about through citizen engagement, local, regional government interacting with citizen groups, interacting with business groups, but especially thinking through the existing tools, the existing levers that one has, like the public bank, like the innovation agency, like the different subsidies and guarantees, to really crowd in as much as possible those bottom-up solutions that I've been stressing. So I rushed towards the end because I just realized we only have 12 minutes left, but I'd love to now just open it up and to answer any questions in Spanish about really the idea of this new approach to policy itself. And feel free to ask any question at all, whether it's on specific Peru issue or more of the abstract concepts.
Mariana, if I may, since we've got a lot of participants, what I would ask is that people use the hand raise function. So if you click on participants at the bottom, it should let you raise your hand, and then we can call on people in order. But I also see that we've got a couple of questions in the chat already. So I invite you to raise your hands clicking on participant or to put them into the chat.
And Kate, are you okay with chairing this session of the answering questions? Good.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe while people look for the hand raise function, which I know is a little bit hidden, we'll start with that first question in the chat from Gabriel del Castillo.
I don't see it. Can you read it
Yes,
out?
I can read it out loud if that helps,
Yeah.
Mariana. Yeah.
Here we go. It seems to me this really, is that the one? Yeah, okay, so I'll read it. It seems to me this really requires a long-term orientation, yes, from the public sector. How can we build that capacity in countries where government have traditionally had a very short-term focus? Exactly. So, you know, the irony is we often complain that it's the business sector that is short-termist and speculative, but we have the same problem inside the public sector. Similarly, we complain that the public sector is too bureaucratic and slow. Often we have the same problem in the private sector. So this is why we focus so much on intra-organizational issues. It's not about big national policies changing, is what does it actually mean for changing how you do stuff? So a public bank is supposed to be long-term thinking, right? But actually, if it's captured along the way to business interests, you know, the businesses that are shouting the loudest, help, help, I need help. That's not long-termist. You're just reactive. And sometimes you're reactive because you think it will bring votes. A lot of the stupid policies around small companies are just for votes. You know, I, as an academic, can tell policymakers, stop giving small companies money just because they're small. And they say, shh, you know, that's where our votes come from. And I'm not against small companies. I think small companies need a lot of help, but not because they're small. You want the small companies to work with you on solving big problems. So that's why we say, don't pick winners, pick the willing. And if the small companies are going to be engaging with you, for example, on a digitalization strategy for the health service, they're going to need a lot of help compared to the medium and the large companies. But you help them because they're going to help you solve a problem. Nah? But these problems, if they can be long-term minded, instead of just reactive, you know, the day, whatever a minister wakes up with, if they can come from consensus building in society, they will also be more long-term. So think again, back to the Sustainable Development Goals. Globally, they were chosen by countries worldwide. You can't just change them every day and be short-termist about them. They are set in stone. But what does it mean to have that stakeholder participation, co-creation at the national level or at the city level, which sets in stone, at least for 5 or 10 years, what, you know, a plan is going to look like, and to make sure that the public organizations themselves are public, but not politicized. In Italy, we had a big public organization called IRI, which was a public enterprise, called the Instituto della Ricostruzione Italiana. 3 phases. First, public, not politicized. Very ambitious. The top managers wanted to be a public servant and work for IRI. And they built the Italian motorway from north to south in 4 years. Very productive, very innovative, very ambitious. Second phase, public, super politicized, very short-termist, because all the parties had their hands inside and they were just thinking about the survival of their own election, you know, kind of status. Third phase, privatized. Terrible. So the second and the third were equally bad. It was public, but politicized, and privatized, where they cut all their research and development spending and just thinking about short-term profits. So this is the challenge. What does it mean to build organizations, an innovation agency or a public bank, which is public, thinking about public goals, is long-termist, but is not politicized. And it even has a life period in terms of, say, the director, which outlasts the electoral cycle, so 5 years, not 4 years, and doesn't coincide with the electoral cycle, but also that explicitly welcomes risk-taking, for example. That's what DARPA does. DARPA actually measures its success by how much risk it takes and how much economy-wide impact it has. So these issues of evaluation, which I think Reiner will be talking to you about more in his lesson, because we just put out a big report on evaluation that we both worked on. You know, these are the issues that make you more long-termist. It has to be embedded also in how you evaluate your policies, what your remit is, but also that internal culture, but also the human resource practice. You have to explicitly tell your people that work in the organization to be bold, to experiment. And if they're so worried that they're going to get fired if they fail, that's the biggest restraint to long-termism, because most long-term thinking is about experimentation.
Thank you. So we've got more questions than we'll have time with, but I invite Arturo. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question verbally if you'd like.
En español, si quieres.
Ok. Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Mi nombre es Arturo Coral. Lo que había estado escuchando y leyendo del lado tuyo es que, por ejemplo, se habla de poner reglas al gobierno, o que el gobierno pueda poner reglas de redistribución que puedan ayudar y apoyar a la masa, ¿no? A la gran cantidad de personas. Pero, ¿cómo del lado de los investigadores y cómo del lado de los emprendedores podríamos sugerir esto al gobierno? Porque viene más del lado del gobierno que de los investigadores y de los emprendedores, ¿no?
Yeah, okay, so I'll answer in English. I mean, so when you say reglas, do you mean rules? Reglas, yeah? Rules.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
My critique is that the government should not just be setting the rules, it should also be investing. But the rules it does set, and this comes to the Spanish government case, the way that we pick the willing and not pick the winners has to be embedded in the rules. When we say tilt the playing field, that means make the playing field reward certain types of behavior. So for example, instead of having ESG metrics, environmental social governance metrics inside companies to make them talk about the sustainable development goals, what does it mean to actually embed those sustainability targets in the tax system, or in, as my example gave for Germany, in the way that the public bank is handing out the loans towards companies that are committing to reducing their material content, or in the COVID bailout, those companies that are willing to, you know, not evade tax and so on. So the more you can embed in the rules certain types of behavior that are quite broad, because you don't want to micromanage. If you micromanage, if you tell companies exactly what to do, you'll stifle innovation because it's all going to be very top down and linear. But you want strong rules of the game. Within that, a lot of different ways, right? So even in the case of the steel industry, the German government didn't tell them how to lower their material content, but they had to do that. How they lowered their material content was an internal decision. They could have done it in many different ways. And that happened through their own innovative decisions, but they had to. That was the rule through which they could access that public subsidy. And again, the work that Kate and her team are thinking about in the Biscay region, where the tax incentives themselves are structured around certain types of sustainable development goal type metrics, is a way that you can use tax incentives not only to reduce the cost, you know, say of research and development or something through the usual tax incentive mentality, but actually really to foster the directionality of that investment as well, but still keeping it quite open so you're not micromanaging, you know, the how. Because most tax incentives that government gives business simply increase profits. They don't actually increase investment. So the additionality, which means, you know, fostering investment to happen that wouldn't have happened anyway, isn't usually a result of tax incentives, unless they are quite ambitious and accompanied by new opportunity creation, so also new investments in an area that make business or researchers think, wow, that's an exciting place to move into.
Great. I realize we're running out of time, so actually I want to end with a question about the pandemic. So let's see, where are we? Yeah, here asked this up at the top. What will be the new focus or change in mission-oriented policy, innovation policy after the pandemic? And just if you could bring in a few more reflections about that. And I do want to say for everyone who's asked questions that we'll pick up many of these themes in subsequent lectures. And we're also happy to be in touch about some of these questions.
Yeah, in fact, we should save them. So maybe
yeah,
we can also bring them. Yeah. we can bring them to the next one. So there's different really interesting COVID moment changes, I think. One is we need to produce differently. So many countries found themselves completely unable to produce the very basic stuff. You know, this is not iPhones. These are personal protection equipment, you know, masks. You know, it's not the most high-tech thing, but when you don't have productive capacity, you end up being overly reliant on other countries. And when it's for a very important thing, a big crisis occurs. And what was interesting, I found in Italy, which, you know, again, I'm from and I'm working with the government, is they had zero capacity. It was all imported from China, the personal protective equipment. But they accessed a special lever they had, which in most countries you have during wartime. So kind of a defense production procurement kind of a lever, where they could actually call in companies very quickly without being, you know, having to go through long procurement methods to produce the much needed equipment. But again, because they did it with strong conditionality imposed, it didn't end up just creating kind of nepotistic, you know, problematic, you know, contract giving to certain companies. They still were able to very quickly embed within the structure of the procurement a way to make sure they were keeping it open and competitive, but they also were able to do it at a certain speed, which meant that in just 3 months, they had 139 companies producing 100% of Italy's PPE, as opposed to being 100% reliant on China, and breaking down what happened there or what happened in other countries, which tends to only happen in wartime situations, and ask what would it look like to make this more normal. So you have strong productive capacity on the ground, but steered towards, you know, a public problem, and using the procurement or the grants to foster that, I think, is an interesting lesson. But also with the vaccine and all the medical equipment that's needed, the point I was saying before about producing differently, actually paying attention to how we design patents and intellectual property to really foster diffusion, collective intelligence, and not rent seeking. I think that's a big lesson. But also how to make sure that we don't just flood the system with money and liquidity, as we did with the financial crisis, but use it to strengthen the system. So health systems globally need serious strengthening. Just because one country doesn't have COVID, if another country gets it and has a weak health system, everyone else is unsafe too. So had this crisis begun in Africa instead of China, we all globally, Peru, the UK, all of us would be much, much worse off because of the very weak health systems in many African countries. So our kind of global solidarity, you know, having a global welfare state, a global health system, as opposed to just national systems that are underfunded, hopefully will be a big outcome. And lastly, I think this issue of conditionality, you know, just getting public and private to really work together in ways that in the past were more just about subsidies and guarantees, and to embed within that conditions that are not sticks, but also carrots, and more about a win-win, kind of a pact, an agreement of how to work together towards a better future, like the help that was given in France, say, to the automotive and airline industry, and they agreed. Whereas in the UK, EasyJet said, no, we don't want any conditions. And the government said, okay, well, we'll help you anyway. And they shouldn't. They should have said, go back to the end of the line. Come back when you change your mind. So I think it's confidence. We need a different level of confidence. And we need to admit that in many cases, there's been power relationships, which as economists, we're not very good at talking about. That's why, Kate, I'm glad you're a political scientist. We need to recognize, you know, the problems in very skewed power relationships that are often embodied in some of these negotiations. And that's also sometimes the state has too much power, and it's too top down, and it's too inertial. I'm not just thinking, you know, the private sector, but each captures the other when you don't have an ambitious goal. And maybe just lastly, just maybe the most interesting project I'm doing right now is with the BBC, because it's, you know, as you know, a very important public broadcaster. Everyone watches the BBC, but they're under attack in the UK from a pretty conservative government. And we've been working with them on how do you measure public value in a public broadcaster that doesn't just do high quality news, but also does soap operas and talk shows, right? So they are different from, say, many public broadcasters because they've been incredibly innovative and doing, soap operas about working class people instead of just about the rich 1% like Dynasty in Dallas. And it's very interesting to help them think through how to codify and make more systemic, and also across different public organizations, these issues of public purpose and public value, which then the Treasury uses to measure their own success. And I'm learning a lot, and it's happening during COVID, but it's not COVID related.
I realized in the chat, I told Efren that he could take the question after Arturo. So
Sure.
if you're okay for one more.
I am.
So
what's the
Efren,
question?
Yeah, you're welcome to come in.
Is there someone?
He should be there.
Maybe you have to unmute.
Efraín.
Ok. Sí, muchísimas gracias, Mariana. Muy buenas tardes, buenos días en Perú. Sí, quisiera hacer un breve comentario y quizás una pregunta. Efectivamente, en la mayoría de los países de América Latina, los estados se han liberalizado, y por decir tan solo un ejemplo, los servicios de investigación y extensión prácticamente son nulos. Y de ahí, y entre otros temas que Mariana muy bien ha explicado, creo que hay la necesidad de una política industrial moderna o política de desarrollo productivo moderno. Ciertamente, este tipo de políticas desde el punto de vista de la gestión se alejan de los modelos tradicionales, lineales, que comienzan con un análisis y terminan con una evaluación. Estos modelos, como bien se ha explicado, ¿no?, requieren modelos de gestión iterativos, coordinación continua y evaluación evolutiva. Y aquí va la pregunta. En nuestros países tenemos problemas de coordinación. No tenemos entidades públicas capaces de superar coordinación pública, público-privada y privada-privada. Entonces, ¿cómo avanzar en este tipo de modelos con países que tienen estos problemas estructurales? ¿Cómo tener tecnologías de gestión pública que permitan resolver estos problemas de la coordinación? Primera pregunta. Segunda, la mayoría de las intervenciones se enfocan mucho en unidades económicas de subsistencia y se ha dejado de lado mucho aquellas unidades que no están en la subsistencia y que tampoco son modernas. Entonces, ¿cómo enfocar la intervención en este tipo de unidades que nos van a ayudar a generar riqueza? Entonces, hay como que un sector in between, ¿no? Un sector intermedio que realmente podría ser importante para las políticas de desarrollo productivo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Such great questions. And I really hope we can continue having this conversation in other ways. So on the first one, really that goes under the heading of a national system of innovation. Everything I'm talking about is useless if we don't have structures in place. But those very structures need to change how they're designed. Hence my point about changing the structure of a public bank. But my experience in Latin America is there's huge differences between countries and what you even have on the ground in terms of the system of innovation. This is why I've always hated the word, the BRICS, what was it? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They were so different one from the other. It didn't mean anything. It's not just about which development path are you on. It's like, what's on the ground? What do you have? Is there a public bank? Is there any public research agency? What is the science industry linkage? All these kinds of questions. And again, in Europe as well, very, very different. In Italy, we have no Fraunhofer institutes, no vocational training for our workers, and a very weak public bank. So even Europe doesn't mean anything. These are countries with very different structures. So in Chile, for example, in Latin America, there's Corfo, a very ambitious public innovation agency. In many parts of Latin America, as you say, either it doesn't exist, or it's being cut, or it's become very, very narrow, and you have a dichotomous static debate about basic research or applied research, as opposed to the kind of origin of what Corfo was even seen to be. Or in Brazil, you have Fiocruz, for example, which is a public innovation agency around big health problems, which is very mission oriented, but many countries don't have that. So I think that's sort of what we need to always remember, which is coming back to my point about horizontal and vertical. Horizontal policies which I didn't go into very much because I think we know a lot about them. We need proper public education. We need proper public research, and that public research needs to be decentralized across different types of agencies, which each need to be quite strong. So blue sky research is the kind of thing, say, that in the US, the National Science Foundation funds, or in Europe, the European Research Council funds. That's for science, basic science, blue sky. You also need, public institutions to really foster the link between science and industry. That's the kind of Fraunhofer Institute or the catapults. And I think the kind of, public agencies which are working alongside the private sector, but retain a very strong kind of public goal around fostering what I've been talking about, as much public-private interaction with strong public agency steering and directionality is absolutely essential. So I think maybe this can become something that in your next lectures you also talk about when you look at the system of innovation. And I think, Kate, you might be focusing a bit on that. But your second question, I think it's so important because that's where the concept of missions fits in so well. So for example, in Sweden, they have a national mission, which is about fossil-free welfare state, but they then land it on very concrete stuff like school meals. Yeah, that the school meals, the food kids eat, students eat at school, they say has to be healthy, sustainable, so carbon neutral across the value chain, and tasty, yummy, not just meatballs in IKEA. And so the fact they have these three ambitious goals for the school meal means that the public service of rendering the food becomes an agent for change, an agent for innovation that brings together so many different sectors, from agriculture to, again, research in organic food, towards local providers and procurers, the regional government. And I think this is where the exciting thing is about missions, that you take the everyday thing, think of all the different public services, from public education, public transport, mobility, health, and use them as levers of innovation for public-private collaboration. That's the middle ground, right? Because it's not a sexy high-tech thing. It's just the everyday, get the meal to the kids, but use it as a lever for innovation. And that's why I obsess so much on procurement, because procurement budgets are very large everywhere. In the UK, our entire innovation budget for the whole government is £10 billion. Just the Ministry of Transport, its procurement budget is £40 billion. So just one ministry, procurement, transport, is 4 times as large as the whole government's innovation budget. And I'm sure that's true in Peru. I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, you need to buy stuff to make the roads, the bridges, the schools, but if you don't use it in an ambitious way, it's a lost opportunity. But your point is that, in terms of your first question, if you don't have proper public organizations that are even fostering the change, thinking about steering, then it's very hard to then get that crowding in. You just end up having a lot of dispersed, at best dispersed, at worst, very parasitic and problematic collaborations. And the privatization of public research and the privatization of public health and private prisons and private, has failed miserably worldwide. But the outsourcing and the privatization has happened due to a strong ideology that has been infiltrated within the government to think it doesn't need to know how to manage, to produce, to govern. So it's lost its capacity. That's why we talk about the dynamic capabilities of the public sector. You need to invest in your own brain. You don't outsource your brain. And I just wrote a book, which is coming out in January, on the moon landing. And the most interesting thing I found, I'm giving away maybe the best chapter, was that the guys in NASA said, we need to be careful. We're going to get screwed by the private sector if we don't, if we become stupid. So they said, even in areas that the private sector is going to do stuff for us, we need to know, we need to research it. We need to have public research so that we're smart when we collaborate. And they even had these words like brochuremanship. They said, we need to be careful for brochuremanship. They knew that the private sector would come in with these beautiful brochures. Look, we do this, we do that. And if they were stupid in NASA, they'd be like, okay, you do it. And, so anyway, I could go on and on, but this is why we're very keen to work with you, through the MPA, but also through maybe things that happen after the MPA or during it, which is maybe to get what we call policy sandboxes, areas where we can experiment with you. What does it look like to do this stuff differently with a strong public push, public investment, but especially a different relationship between public and private, which has that direction that I was talking about in the beginning, but also literally write the contracts differently. And if you don't have the public resources like public research centers in the back, a lot of this will be hard.
Great. So Mariana, we've kept you past the hour, and I really appreciate you taking the extra time. So many good questions in the chat, and I'm very happy to say that this is just the beginning of this collaboration, just the beginning of this set of sessions that continues into the new year, rather than the end. So I'm looking forward to seeing many of you again, and I'm going to put the feedback form in the chat again if you have time to do that. But a big round of applause to Mariana, to the organizers, to the embassy, to CONCITEC, and the British Council. So very much appreciated, and take care, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias a todos.
Ciao.
Gracias, gracias. Thank you, Mariana.
Chao. Thank you.
Gracias.
Sí, sí, muy
Thank you.
Gracias.
listo.
Hasta luego.
Luego, chao.
Chao.
Gracias.
Muy
Gracias.
bien. Hasta luego.
Thank you.
Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.